Today we, Homo sapiens, are the only human species left, but that wasn't always the case. For millions of years there thrived a great range of early human species, from small-brained island dwellers in Indonesia to the robust Neanderthals that dominated so much of Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Here's our list of extraordinary early humans that went extinct.
Helping me out in this video are human evolution experts Dr. Chris Stringer and Professor Fred Spoor from the Natural History Museum, alongside specialists from a number of History Hit Ancients interviews we've recorded over the years. So without further ado, let's get started.
Number 1. Australopithecus. Australopithecus lived between roughly 4 and 2 million years ago in Africa, and they looked very ape-like. They had an ape-sized brain and a protruding face with a big brow ridge above the eyes, but their teeth showed more human-like features.
This is a replica of a female Australopithecus cranium, so the lower jaw is of course missing. We are, as humans and all our ancestors in our lineage, in our tree, are characterized by one very important thing. Our canine teeth, which you can feel with your tongue in the corners of your mouth, your canine teeth are small, they are not sticking out. And to really illustrate this, I should actually bring out our closest relative. If we look at a chimpanzee, for instance here, it's immediately visible that those teeth in the corner and space in front of them, which accommodates the rather sticking out canine teeth at the lower jaw. And that's a very particular character that we all share, all our ancestors going back probably as far back as 7 million years ago.
Going further down the body, the bones and pelvic structure of an Australopithecus suggests that this species was bipedal, namely that they walked upright on 2 legs, albeit probably in quite a different motion to how we walk today.
If you go to the upper torso and you go to the arms and the shoulders, they actually in many respects still have a touch of apeness in it. And it's a big debate for a long time whether that is a remnant from the past that is no longer very important, or they were actually still really actively climbing. So it's a combination of being two-legged, bipedal on the ground, and climbing in trees as well for things like sleeping at night, foraging.
Australopithecus was so successful that it had several different subspecies. There was Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba in South Africa. Further north, in Central and Eastern Africa, you had several more species, such as Australopithecus gari, Australopithecus anamensis, and the biggest tongue twister of them all, Australopithecus bahrel-ghazali. But of all of these subspecies, the iconic one is Australopithecus afarensis, named after the Afar region of Ethiopia, where its most famous specimen was discovered 50 years ago. She's called Lucy. You may well have heard of her, one of the most complete early hominin skeletons ever discovered.
Named after the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was played in camp when the fossil was found. This is actually what you call a partial skeleton. It's rather a ragtag bag of bones and fragments. It's not very pretty. There's not much left of the head, but it was nevertheless the first somewhat more complete skeleton. It's in fact one of the smallest individuals of Australopithecus that we know about.
Now Lucy often steals the headlines, but she's not the only extraordinary Australopithecus skeleton that's been found. In the early 2000s, paleoanthropologists found the remains of a baby Australopithecus that died when it was just 3 years old. Roughly 3 million years old, it's the oldest child that we have physical remains surviving of. For a human ancestor living more than 1 million years ago, compared to other early species, we actually have quite a lot of fossils surviving of Australopithecus, including lots of their teeth.
And it's now generally accepted that that early group, Australopithecus and relatives, that they had a diet that was largely focused on plant foods, probably also grubs and insects and other things, just like you see in chimpanzees. You can see this partly from the teeth, the sort of scratches that are left on it, but you can also see it from the isotopes that are preserved inside the teeth. So it's from a package of different bits of evidence.
Australopithecus was also a tool user. The first known tools are roughly 3.3 million years old and come from the site of Lemekwi near Lake Turkana in Kenya. It's likely that groups of Australopiths were using similar, very simple tools.
Really demonstrate that even early on in human evolution, stone tools were manufactured in some way or another.
So what happened to them? Well, Australopithecus disappears from the human record around 2 million years ago. They had been living alongside several other species of early humans in Africa, and it could be that a competition for resources caused their downfall. Regardless, having been around for almost 2 million years, they had a very good run.
If we think about human evolution, people always ask the question, where do we really come from? What is sort of at the beginning? Now, the real beginning, I have to emphasize that the real beginning we estimate is around 7 million years ago, and that first half of that whole period we don't know that much about. But by about 4 million years ago, we get an insight into sort of what is really the basis of our branches that lead eventually to us. And Australopithecus really takes a vital role there. It's a creature that represents that combination of being relatively primitive chimpanzee-like in the head, with being two-legged, bipedal, walking on the grounds, having all those adaptations, as sort of a template from which everything else evolved.
It was now time for a new species to rise to the top, not just in Africa, but further afield too. Number 2, Homo erectus. So this is a big one, the longest lived human species ever to grace this earth. So as far as we know, the Homo genus, that is the genus that we belong to, humans, emerged in Africa roughly 2.5 million years ago with a species called Homo habilis. Habilis had a bigger brain size than Australopithecus and smaller teeth, but it wasn't quite yet fully bipedal. Like Australopithecus, it seems that Habilis was still very adept at climbing trees. Well, that all changed with Homo erectus, which emerged in Africa roughly 2 million years ago. Erectus had a much bigger brain size than Habilis and was generally just larger. But the real game changer in Erectus's anatomy was in its pelvis and limb proportions.
So this is the pelvic girdle of Homo erectus. It belongs to this skull. It's called the Nariakatomi boy. It is pretty much the same shape as ours. It's a bit smaller, but it's got that same dish effect that we have. And we know from the articulation of the femur, the upper leg bone, that it articulates in the same way that ours does. And it gives us a strong indication that they were able to move in pretty much the same way that we're able to move. So that's how we know that they're a runner. They're fully bipedal. They are what they call an obligate biped. That is their absolute normal mode of locomotion. There's no tree climbing or anything left. These are really critical parts of helping us to understand the behavior and the potential behaviors for Erectus as well.
Yes, it's a funny name, but this is why Erectus is called Homo erectus, literally upright man. It's this development that many scientists believe is key to one of the most fascinating parts of Erectus's story, namely how far across the world they ultimately spread. The earliest known human species to spread out of Africa, remains of Erectus have been found in places as far away as China and Indonesia. Moving in social groups, Erectus communities inhabited large parts of the Eurasian world, and what was more, they brought a very interesting object with them.
Erectus, we believe, is the inventor of the hand axe. So what you have here is what they call a bifacial tool, or it's been shaped on two faces.
And napping is just
napping is the process of taking flakes off in a controlled manner to impose a shape on the stone itself. One of the most critical inventions in all of human history. Without these, there'd be no phones or space shuttles or cars or anything like this. This is a mobile tool for a very mobile hunter. You can carry this around with you. You can resharpen it just by finding a pebble and putting a new edge on it. You can butcher with it. You can fillet meat. You can scrape the flesh off a skin. This shape does not exist in nature. This shape is not suggested by the rock that you're napping. You have to carry this shape in your head. You impose the shape like a sculptor imposes shape upon the marble. And you learn that from your social group. You pick it up socially, you carry it socially, and you pass it on socially.
When it comes to incredible extinct human species, Homo erectus has to be on any list. They are a game changer in the story of human evolution. In some parts of the world, erectus was still around almost 200,000 years ago. So why did they die out?
We believe that erectines develop into Homo heidelbergensis. For a long time, they may well have been in parallel with each other. This is in Africa. So this is called Bodo. It's about 600,000 years old. It's one, well, in fact, I think it's the earliest clear-cut Heidelberg that we've ever found in Africa. The oldest erectines we have in Africa are about 1 million years, maybe coming down in certain disputed specimens to 900,000 or 800,000. By about 600,000, we don't see them anymore. Although there may be 1 or 2 examples that some people agree with. Did things change? Why would this be a more successful adaptation? Did this outcompete the parent, in a sense? You know, did the child do better than the adult, than mum and dad? We don't really know. All we know is that by about 600,000 in Africa, you don't see any more clear-cut, unambiguous erectines. You just find the Heidelbergs. Perhaps they were better at being more social. Perhaps their ability to hunt, to compete, was better developed. We don't know. So for the Javan species, down at about 100,000, why did they last longer there than anywhere else in the world? We don't know.
Number 3, Homo floresiensis. Staying in East Asia, hot on the heels of Homo erectus, is one of the most confusing but extraordinary human species ever discovered. It's called Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, because that's right, you guessed it, the remains of this species were incredibly small. It appeared to be a dwarf species of human, found only on the Indonesian island of Flores. The first fossils of Homo floresiensis were discovered 20 years ago in 2003, so right at the time that the Lord of the Rings trilogy was reaching its end, hence the nickname, the Hobbit.
Homo floresiensis is really a very unusual creature. So if I bring up Homo erectus here and I hold it next to the cranium of Homo floresiensis, we can see that there's an enormous difference in size. So it's a tiny creature. It's well known from the fossil record that when mammals and other creatures arrive on islands, and very often the predators are no longer present, that the whole body starts to change. And one thing that almost universally happens is that the body size reduces. There are examples of miniature elephants, miniature hippos on the islands of the Mediterranean. And actually, together with the fossils of Homo floresiensis, there is a miniature elephant, stegodon it's called, as well present, because the island of Flores is really quite isolated and there are no natural predators other than Komodo dragons.
Now, there is still so much that puzzles scientists about Homo floresiensis. From the remains we do have, their diets might have included both plants and uncooked meat from creatures like stegodon, the rodents, and maybe even Komodo dragons. But one of the biggest puzzles about floresiensis is how it reached the island of Flores.
That's one question, how did it get there, but also where did it come from, what was the ancestral species. Now, close by, the only species we know at that time is Homo erectus, and there are certain features, a good number of features in the skull that really remind us of Homo erectus. So in that concept, in that interpretation, it really is a dwarf of Homo erectus that lived on Java, rafted in some way or another, not on purpose, but just in a storm or whatever, a family group, whatever, may have rafted to Flores and become isolated, and it shrinks in size, and voila, we have Homo floresiensis. Now, if you look at other parts of the body, they say, well, it's actually so primitive that can't possibly come from Homo erectus. This must come from an earlier ancestor. Now the problem with this is that we absolutely have no evidence for any other hominin leaving Africa other than Homo erectus. So in my book, the possibility that it's sort of a descendant of a very early arrival of Homo erectus, not one of the really later ones, but a very early arrival of Homo erectus is still the most plausible.
Now, these Indonesian islands are fascinating when it comes to studying peculiar human species that are now extinct. On the island of Luzon, another small early human has also been discovered, Homo luzonensis. And this is just the beginning. It's likely that even more, as of yet unknown archaic human species are waiting to be discovered on islands across Indonesia. Watch this space. Number 4, Homo naledi. From one extraordinary small-brained, small-bodied human species to another, discovered in the depths of a cave system in South Africa. It's called Homo naledi. You might have heard of it from the recent documentary on Netflix, Cave of Bones. Naledi remains were first discovered in 2013, and initial excavations of the cave chamber revealed hundreds of fossils, one of the richest human evolution sites in the world.
We had dozens and dozens of individuals, all from this chamber. Something like 1,500 fossils on that first expedition from an excavated area of about 1 meter by 50 centimeters.
With access to so many fossils, Lee Berger and his team were able to piece together the skeletons of Homo naledi, and its anatomy shared similarities with species such as Australopithecus and Homo habilis.
It's been very positive the way that the material has been made available, and very quickly replicas were made available. So we had replicas within a year of the material to put in our human evolution display. If we look at the bits of the skull and the jaw, and these are replicas. First of all, a small brain. This is a gorilla-sized brain inside that brain case, so very small-brained. Quite a strong brow ridge for just a small specimen. Relatively thin-walled, so not sort of primitive in that respect. The jawbone's interesting because it has, of course, no chin at the front. It's quite robust. The teeth are primitive in the sense that, for example, they get bigger towards the end of the dental row, but they are small teeth. And in that sense, they look really quite human in terms of tooth size. And when we look at something like the hand bones, we can see it's first of all a very small hand, but it's got a long thumb, and that's a very human feature. And yet the digits are curved, as we would find in Australopithecines and in the great apes, and that suggests this creature was still probably climbing around in the trees as well as walking upright on the ground, because the whole skeleton shows this interesting combination that the hip bones and the legs and feet suggest good upright walking on 2 legs, and yet the upper body, the shoulders and the arms and the hands suggest that this creature was also still good in the trees.
Its brain size was also quite small, not much bigger than an ape's, and yet, when these bones were dated, they revealed that naledi had in fact been living some 300,000 years ago, alongside early Homo sapiens, much later in the story of human evolution than expected.
And that's really quite recent for something that's got an ape-sized brain, living in South Africa, at a time when we think early Homo sapiens was around elsewhere in Africa, and there was a species called Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis, which was still around, we think, in Zambia. So at least 3 kinds of humans, but this one much smaller brained and seemingly more primitive.
So let's talk about where these naledi remains were discovered. The cave system is called Rising Star, and the naledi remains were discovered right at the bottom of this system, below an incredibly thin chute. Hundreds of fossils just lying there on the surface. So what were they doing there, so deep in the cave system? Well, this is where things start getting controversial. Leader of the excavation is paleoanthropologist Lee Berger. Lee is convinced that he's found evidence that naledi were venturing to this cave chamber to bury their dead. Now, this is a huge claim, because if naledi were burying their dead, this small-brained hominin had the complexity of thought to think of an afterlife. Until this point, it has been believed that practices like burial were only capable by large-brained humans, modern humans, us, but also possibly Neanderthals. So this claim, well, it's raised quite a few eyebrows.
We assume that evolution has driven that large brain for a good reason, linked with complex behaviour. And yet here's a creature with a brain less than half our brain size that seemingly is also doing that complex behaviour. So that would raise the question, why do we have such big brains if naledi can do all this complex behaviour with such a small brain? So that's one of the critical questions. And of course then there's the strength of the evidence. A paper criticising these claims has just come out, which really, I think, dissects the claims, it tests them, and they conclude there is no good evidence that naledi buried its dead, no good evidence that naledi produced those engravings, if indeed they are engravings and not natural marks, and the evidence of fire, the jury's out on that because the evidence hasn't even been published properly, but how do we know that those fires were made by naledi and not by, for example, later humans that were in the cave? So really many question marks about those claims now.
Regardless, let's not overlook the sheer amazingness of the discovery. A small-brained human surviving very late in the story of human evolution. And no doubt, more information about this exciting early human will be revealed in the years ahead. Number 5, Neanderthals. You can't talk about extinct human species and not mention the Neanderthals. Now, for a long time, Neanderthals were viewed as the classic other in the story of human evolution. The less intelligent scavenger hominin that lost out to Homo sapiens in this great game and went extinct. But that view has changed in recent years.
Okay, well, I've got a replica, a nice replica reconstruction of a Neanderthal here. And you can see some of the typical features. So a big brain in there, a brain the same size as ours essentially, but the brain case is longer and lower. There's this big brow ridge, double arch brow ridge at the front. The forehead is low. You've got perhaps the most distinctive feature when you look at a cranium, this middle of the face pulled forwards, this great big nose. I mean, a lot of us have got big noses, a high nose or a projecting nose or a wide nose. The Neanderthals had all three combined. And the cheekbones are swept back behind that nose. So the middle of the face is pulled forwards, very characteristic. The teeth, large incisors. Overall the teeth are quite small, not too different to ours in size, but the front teeth are relatively bigger. You can see they're heavily worn on this individual, and that's something we often find. On the lower jaw, there's not really much sign of a chin. And of course, here in the ear region, CT scanning shows us that the middle and inner ear bones of Neanderthals, involved with hearing and balance, they were a slightly different shape to ours. And so even those tiny bones can tell us whether it's a Neanderthal or a Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals were around until about 40,000 years ago, we think. We lose sight of them in the fossil evidence around 40,000 years ago. How far back in time they go depends on what we call a Neanderthal. So there's some material from the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones, Atapuerca, dated at about 430,000 years old. And this is a wonderful collection, a huge collection of fossils from deep in a cave system. Every part of the skeleton is represented. And in the teeth, these fossils look very Neanderthal. And there's even some DNA, the oldest human DNA ever recovered from a couple of the fossils. And that suggests this material is early on the Neanderthal lineage. So on that basis, we've got about 400,000 years of the evolution of Neanderthals in Europe and Asia.
Neanderthals were big and bulky. Their bodies were robustly built to withstand a very active lifestyle. Having such a big body meant that Neanderthals required more energy than we do today, more food. And thanks to a number of Neanderthal sites that have been discovered across Eurasia, we know quite a bit about their diet. Neanderthals were expert hunters. From the site of Schöningen in Germany, several wooden spears have been discovered that are some 300,000 years old, right at the time of Neanderthals in Europe. They also used stone-tipped spears, which were almost certainly used for hunting animals, both large and small.
We have these sort of Levallois points, which we think may have started to be used to tip spears. Potentially they started tipping their spears with stones about 230,000 years ago, something like that. It's really important to note though that they didn't stop making wooden spears, right?
Okay.
So they kept on making wooden spears as well. There's a later site called Laringen, which dates to about 125,000 years ago, where there's a complete yew spear found in association with a butchered elephant. a straight-tusked elephant, which is an enormous animal. So wood spears continue to be made, but potentially they start, using stone-tipped spears as well.
Specially crafted scrapers made of rock, such as flint, were then used to butcher a hunted animal's corpse and extract as much food from the carcass as possible. Nothing went to waste in these hunter-gatherer societies. Prey could include the iconic Ice Age megafauna, great beasts such as woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos. At the Paleolithic site of La Côte de Saint-Brelade on the island of Jersey, heaps of butchered mammoth and rhino bones have been discovered dating to the time of Neanderthals, more than 100,000 years ago. La Côte seems to have been an important base for Neanderthal communities, who would have hunted herds of animals such as mammoth on the great plain that this cave looked out onto back in the Paleolithic. But their food could also include smaller prey too, and Neanderthals' diet varied depending on where in the world that community was living. But let's talk about cannibalism. There is some evidence for it. However, these cases are rare, and cannibalism certainly doesn't seem to have been a staple of a Neanderthal's diet. Away from meat and hunting, analysis of Neanderthal teeth from sites like Shanidar Cave in the Near East suggests that these communities also ate a great variety of plants, nuts, seeds and fruits for instance. Neanderthals were expert hunters, but they were also expert gatherers too.
So of course the picture we've got of Neanderthal archaeology is based mainly on cave sites where the material is well preserved, where they were living. There is evidence in some open sites, and of course we know sea levels have changed. So at the peaks of the last ice age, the sea level fell 125 metres, and there were large areas of land exposed in the Mediterranean, for example, and between Britain and Europe there was a big area of dry land called Doggerland, which was around during the time of the Neanderthals. And we know the Neanderthals were occupying that landscape, so Neanderthal stone tools are found on that seabed. They're dredged up in fishermen's nets, they're washed up on the shore. So we know Neanderthals are there, and there's even part of a Neanderthal fossil from the North Sea, which was recovered in the Netherlands, part of the frontal bone of a Neanderthal. So there are Neanderthal fossils down there as well.
Living in small groups, Neanderthals were a dominant human species in Europe for hundreds of years. They even survived in Britain, on this distant edge of the inhabitable world. So don't imagine Neanderthals walking around naked. They would have worn some sort of clothing. What that clothing looks like, however, we don't know. There's also evidence of Neanderthal art, of fire making, and potentially of burial.
Some people 20 or more years ago doubted that Neanderthals buried their dead. They argued that these Neanderthal bodies in caves were victims of roof falls, or the bones had just washed, the body had just washed into a crevice and then been covered up. But I think there's now plenty of evidence from a number of sites that Neanderthals intentionally buried their dead. We've got objects inside the graves that look like they've been put there with the body. We've even got coverings of the body. So for example, a Neanderthal baby was buried in Syria with a stone slab on top of the body, and that stone slab was brought from outside the cave. It's not part of the cave wall that just fell down. And their technology, they're making things like spears, throwing spears. They're even making resin to attach the heads, the stone tool heads, onto a handle of wood. Producing that resin and making it into a glue requires a series of special steps to make it really effective, and Neanderthals were capable of that.
Neanderthals existed roughly between 500,000 and 40,000 years ago, which means yes, they did have interactions with modern humans. Not just that, but we know that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens too.
So maybe around 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had emerged from Africa, stayed behind in Africa of course as well, but a small group of Homo sapiens came out into Western Asia, and soon after that they encountered Neanderthals, and there was a process of interbreeding between these groups. And as a result of that, we, outside of Africa, everyone has about 2% of Neanderthal DNA still in their genomes from that ancient interbreeding. And remarkably, in Denisova Cave in Siberia, there's evidence that Neanderthals were interbreeding with us Homo sapiens, but there were people there called the Denisovans, and there is a first generation hybrid. A bone has been analysed for its DNA, and it's about 50% Neanderthal and 50% Denisovan. So that is a girl who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. One day we're going to find the same sort of evidence for us and Neanderthals. Sooner or later there will be actual hybrids found of the direct mating between a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens.
Thanks to work done by archaeologists across Eurasia, the age-old view of Neanderthals as stupid scavengers who are always going to lose out to the cleverer and superior Homo sapiens, well, that has been put to bed. But Neanderthals did ultimately die out. The big question is why?
So the disappearance of the Neanderthals, I mean, first of all, we have to argue really whether, are they actually extinct if, you know, there's 2% of their DNA in a lot of people alive today. Some people have calculated that if you put all the DNA around the world together from Neanderthals in different people's genomes, you could actually reconstruct 40 or 50% of the Neanderthal genome. And of course that's present in billions of people. So actually there's more Neanderthal DNA on Earth today than there was 50,000 years ago. That's a remarkable thought. Yes, physically extinct, they disappeared as far as we know about 40,000 years ago. So why did they disappear? I mean, the short answer is we don't know. There are many different ideas, and I think it was probably a combination of things. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they disappeared not long after Homo sapiens started to get into their territories and grew in numbers. You know, in a sense, you know, you could say they were an endangered species perhaps, and that appearance of another human species alongside them might have been finally what tipped them over the edge to extinction. A lot of climate change going on at that time. That may have affected their numbers. The possibility that there were some external events, a huge volcanic eruption about 39,000 years ago in Italy. Some people have said there was a burst of cosmic radiation. But from 50,000 years onwards, we start to see this gradual dominance of Homo sapiens, probably at the expense of these other human species.
So there you have it, our list of the 5 most extraordinary early humans to go extinct. Please like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments.